Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're taking on one of those subjects that, well, it governs so much of our lives, our anxieties, our biggest decisions, and yet it's probably the single greatest taboo in modern romance. It's the one thing everyone feels deeply, but we all pretend is somehow secondary.
We're talking about the financial reality of love.
Exactly.
We're going to be confronting the silent influence of money in romantic relationships.
Yeah.
And for so many people, just hearing that topic probably feels like, well, like you're walking past a closed door in your own home every single day.
Yeah.
You know, there's probably chaos behind it, but you just hope that if you ignore it, it'll, I don't know, magically resolve itself.
Right. And our mission today is, I think, a really profound one. We're working with a powerful set of sources that take this conversation way beyond just, how to budget as a couple.
Oh, absolutely.
They use these incredible philosophical anchors. We're talking about the existential confusion of Albert Camus and the sort of bureaucratic despair of Franz Kafka to frame this whole conflict.
Which is such a powerful way to look at it.
It is. And the goal here, for you listening, is to help achieve a really critical shift in perspective. It's about moving away from self-blame.
That's key.
Away from that nagging idea that your love is somehow impure because it involves money, and moving toward a place of, well, constructive and mature dialogue.
And that initial truth, which, all of our sources really distill down, is just, it's unavoidable. We are socialized, we're taught to believe that love exists in this ethereal realm.
Right, it's all poetry and emotion.
It's purely of the heart. But the actual structure of modern life, it demands something completely different. It demands that we learn to love with our finances.
That really is the core paradox of romance today, isn't it?
It is.
We're all operating under this myth of pure idealism, but our reality is governed by logistics. I mean, once you get past the first few dates and you actually try to build a life together,
you're immediately hit with rent and utilities, groceries, maybe childcare. Just this constant, relentless stack of bills that, as one of our sources puts it so bluntly, no poem can save.
And that financial reality, that clash, that is what a thinker like Camus would call the absurd.
Explain that.
It's the fundamental conflict between our deep human desire for pure, meaningful connection and the cold, rational, and relentlessly demanding universe we actually live in.
Okay.
In a relationship, that absurdity shows up because money becomes this silent, decisive character in the story. It's the ghost in the machine of romance.
And it's a ghost with a huge amount of power.
Immense power. Think about it. A missed car payment or an unexpected medical bill that doesn't just, lower your bank balance.
Right.
It radically shifts the entire mood of an evening. It injects this sharp, cold anxiety where there was calm just a moment before. It can hijack what was supposed to be a tender conversation and turn it into a tense, awful negotiation.
And so ultimately, this silent character money often ends up determining the quality, the stability, and the entire future of the partnership. Right. It's the existential pressure point. We're just thrown into this shared financial life with no rules, no guidebook.
None.
And yet we're judged by ourselves and by others as if we should have been masters of this game all along.
Okay, so let's unpack the social conditioning. Why is this the one subject we are so terrified to bring up with the person we claim to love more than anyone? It really boils down to this fear of being seen as, what, cold? Calculating?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We are culturally trained to see any mention of finances within the context of love as a kind of moral failing.
Right.
The fear of being labeled practical, or even worse, self-interested, it's profound. Because it suggests you lack that idealized pure love we were just talking about.
You're breaking the spell.
You're breaking the spell.
Yeah.
We're all chasing that cinematic, effortless affection. And anything that reminds us of a sprayed feels like it shatters the illusion.
And the sources are so clear that this denial, this silence, it's completely counterproductive. I mean, by refusing to talk about money, we don't make its influence go away.
We do the opposite. We actually give it far more control over us.
How so?
Well, this active refusal to acknowledge the financial reality of the relationship, it doesn't make the problems vanish. It just drives their influence underground.
Into the shadows.
Exactly. And the source material notes that anything that's allowed to operate in the dark, unspoken debts, hidden anxieties about spending, unacknowledged income gaps, it often have exponentially more destructive power than the things we're actually brave enough to look at in the light. it metastasizes, it becomes toxic.
So this is that daily erosion of idealism you mentioned. It's not one big catastrophe, it's the 1,000 tiny paper cuts from these real-world stressors.
Yes.
Can you give us some of those concrete examples from the sources?
Yeah, and there are things that I think everyone will recognize. Think about how quickly a tiny financial moment can become a huge emotional battle. For instance, a disagreement that just erupts, seemingly out of nowhere, over an unexpectedly expensive weekend trip that one partner planned as a surprise.
Right, what was meant to be a loving gesture.
A loving gesture becomes a source of conflict.
Yeah.
Or, a fight about buying a new piece of furniture. The argument isn't really about the sofa. It's about the deep, sickening anxiety that the price tag triggers in the other partner.
An anxiety they haven't talked about?
An anxiety that could stem from credit card debt they're hiding, or deep job insecurity they feel ashamed of.
It's that moment where one person's comfort zone, their normal, is the other person's existential threat.
Precisely. And that leads to this truly devastating realization that the research highlights. So many relationships don't actually fail because the love ran out. They don't fail because the personalities fundamentally clashed. They fail because two completely distinct financial worlds, two different cultures of risk, of saving, of spending, could not be successfully and crucially transparently merged.
That realization, to know that you broke up over structure and logistics, not a lack of affection, that has to be just soul-crushing.
It's the ultimate tragedy of modern love. And this failure, it almost always leads to this crushing internal guilt.
The self-blame cycle.
The self-blame cycle. The sources describe partners feeling this overwhelming sense of inadequacy, believing that they are failing at romance itself.
Right.
Because they lack the financial means to meet what society implicitly defines as the minimum standard of loving.
Wow. The minimum standard of loving.
Yes. They feel like they're insufficient as partners because their bank account reflects insufficiency. And that feels more real than their emotional commitment.
Okay, this is the perfect entry point for this powerful metaphor of Kafka.
Yeah.
If he were to analyze a modern couple, he wouldn't see a fairy tale at all. He'd see a bureaucracy.
A crushing, confusing bureaucracy. The relationship itself becomes this long, menacing corridor. And at the very end of this corridor, checking all the credentials you need to move forward.
To get to the next stage.
To get to marriage, to having a family, to buying that first home. Sitting there is money, acting as this silent, impartial administrative clerk.
And the real terror of Kafka's court, of the trial, is that you never know the charges. The law is a secret known only to the administrators.
That's the key. That's the structural flaw in modern love. This clerk, this economic reality, it's checking your ledger against a set of completely unwritten, publicly unverified conditions.
Like what?
The minimum acceptable salary, the maximum allowable student debt, the required savings to income ratio to be deemed responsible. There are no guidebooks printed for dating couples about this.
No.
But those who fail the financial audit are just silently rejected. They drift apart, they tell their friends it was irreconcilable differences or that the spark was gone.
But they don't know why?
They never realize they simply failed to meet the opaque economic conditions required by the system to proceed to the next level.
So the systemic anxiety, it directly undermines the stability of affection itself. It's not just about having enough cash, it's about having the mental bandwidth left over to actually be a loving person.
That is the painful truth our sources really uncover. Affection, generosity of spirit, patience, these are not infinite resources.
Right.
They are fundamentally tied to the energy we have left to give. And that energy is inextricably linked to our mental and emotional stability.
And stability is tied to money.
And that stability in our world is tied to money. So if a couple is constantly swimming in anxiety over economic precarity, worrying about rent, inflation, supporting their parents, their capacity for gentle, expansive love is it's drastically depleted. They're living in a state of what the research calls existential fatigue.
And that fatigue, that's what fuels the self-blame. We see the problem is about money, and our first thought is, my love isn't strong enough to overcome this.
Exactly. We try to uphold these incredibly high idealistic standards, the kind you learn from romantic comedies, while society is simultaneously using structural economics to tear those very standards down.
It's an impossible situation.
It is, and that process of self-accusation,
Right.
That's the invisible Kafka court in session. We are the accused, feeling guilty or inadequate, or maybe even feeling calculating. But we don't know who the accuser is, society's pressures. We don't know the specific charge failing some unwritten economic test.
And we don't have the language to defend ourselves.
We don't. And so the real act of courage, the first step, It's just accepting that money and affection are, in our time, inseparable. And that acceptance, it doesn't spoil love, it grounds it in reality. And that makes it infinitely more resilient.
Okay, so if that Kafka core is happening at the micro level, inside the relationship, we need to zoom out now to the macro level. Where did all this structural pressure even begin? Why does financial capability act as such a powerful stand-in for a person's value when it comes to commitment?
To understand that, you have to look structurally, and you have to look historically. It really goes back to when societies first began organizing themselves around specialized labor.
Okay.
As humans moved from purely communal hunter-gatherer living to systems based on individual productivity, money quickly became the universal shorthand. It was the measure of one's capacity for stability, for survival, and for contribution to the group.
So it wasn't designed to measure someone's worthiness for love.
No.
But it was designed to measure their capacity for life. And over centuries, society just conflated the two.
Precisely. And society has spent all that time building these powerful, inherited labels around that capacity.
Right.
Structurally, the person with strong finances is seen as stable, reliable, capable.
Ready for the future.
Right. And the financially weak person, often through no fault of their own, gets automatically labeled unready or a risk.
And it's so important as a source of stress to understand that these aren't character flaws. These are societal prejudices.
They are structural inheritances, 100%. These labels come from decades of economic policy, from historical labor patterns, systemic inequality, and very rigid cultural expectations, especially around that traditional provider role. So when two people meet, they're not just exchanging pleasantries, they're exchanging their inherited economic histories. And those histories can feel as light as a breath on the surface in those first few dates.
But they're heavy as stone underneath.
They're heavy as stone, and their implications for long-term survival together.
We think we're choosing our partners freely, based purely on chemistry and connection, but we're being pulled by these enormous, invisible structural currents, and this is where that Camus analysis of human fear becomes so relevant.
That's right, because the cold light of Camus's philosophy reveals that we don't just love with pure emotion, we love with fear.
What kind of fear?
Well, the modern person loves with a deeply amplified fear of poverty, a fear of instability, a fear of not being able to maintain the lifestyle they or their family expects of them.
And the specific fear of choosing the wrong partner financially.
The specific gnawing fear of marrying someone who cannot share the rapidly increasing burden of modern life.
And what makes this era's fear so much more acute than, say, 50 or 60 years ago?
It's the scale of the economic instability. It has fundamentally changed the dating calculus. We're operating in an economy where the costs of key life milestones, we're talking housing, education, childcare, they are rising exponentially faster than the median income.
The math just doesn't work anymore.
The math doesn't work. As the sources point out, modern romance is being relentlessly squeezed between relentless inflation, systemic job instability, and this huge societal pressure to achieve success early in life. The fear is amplified because the stakes for failing feel so much higher, and the path to stability is so much longer and more fraught than it was for our parents' generation.
And this intense pressure, it means that your financial posture doesn't just affect your big life decisions. It fundamentally determines the way you are even capable of loving.
Absolutely. It changes your internal operating system for relationships. Consider the stark difference. A partner who is carrying crippling student loan debt, or maybe supporting aging parents, they enter a relationship with immense caution. They often view every shared expense, every dinner out, through the lens of a looming financial crisis. Their capacity for spontaneity is just, it's limited.
And contrast that with
someone who has significant inherited wealth or a stable source of passive income. Their approach to love and life can be expansive, it can be generous, it can feel secure, and these differences, they are not moral judgments.
Right.
They are the unavoidable consequences of the economic circumstances that the system has assigned to them.
And yet, when these differences inevitably cause friction, we blame it on internal qualities. We say, you're not spontaneous enough, or on the other side, you're too reckless with money.
We intellectualize the conflict away from its structural source. We call it incompatibility or a failure of commitment, when what's really happening is the collision of two radically different economic realities.
So the couple hasn't run out of love.
They've been exhausted by the non-stop grinding stress of trying to merge two lives that society has prepared for that merger in wildly divergent ways. It's existential exhaustion disguised as personal drama.
Let's turn to a major cultural amplifier of this. The sources specifically talk about things like the traditional Asian cultural concept of van ho adong, but this cultural silence around money is incredibly widespread.
Yes. That specific example from traditional Asian cultures, where openly discussing money in the context of love is often seen as polluting or even profane.
The ultimate sign of vulgarity.
Right. It illustrates a much broader phenomenon. In any culture that prizes idealism and emotional purity in romance, we suppress the topic. We enforce this silence, believing that we're preserving the purity of affection.
But the result is the exact opposite, isn't it?
It's paradoxically the opposite. The silence grants money more control. By forbidding open discussion, we allow finance to operate solely through unspoken expectations, through shame, and through passive aggression. It's just like the Kafka frame. What is forbidden to be spoken becomes the thing that secretly controls us the most.
And this leads directly to what you call the financial culture clash within the relationship?
It does. Every single person walks into a relationship carrying an invisible financial map that was downloaded into their brain from their family history.
What do you mean by a financial map?
It's all the unspoken rules. How was money handled in your childhood home? Was debt a secret, shameful thing? Was saving seen as a moral imperative? Was spending money on pleasure deemed selfish or frivolous?
Right.
So when these two unique, unexamined maps collide, let's say a saver who was raised by financially conservative parents meets a spender who was raised in an environment of immediate gratification, conflicts are completely inevitable.
So a fight over whether to buy a new car or just repair the old one, it's not really about the car at all.
Not at all. It's the collision of two separate, inherited philosophies about risk, about security, about the future.
And those clashes are so routinely misidentified.
Constantly. The couple thinks we have an emotional issue or we just have different attitudes. But what they're really doing is navigating the messy intersection of two different family financial histories, which are themselves reflections of separate social and economic circumstances. The fundamental truth just remains. No love can be completely independent of economic reality. The heart can be pure, but the human being is constrained by limitations. And in the modern world, those limitations are overwhelmingly financial.
So we've set up the structural context. Now let's zoom in on the specific processes, the gears in the machine. Our source material gives this brilliant framework of 6 powerful mechanisms that essentially institutionalize this pressure.
Yeah.
And it's important to remember money itself is neutral.
It's just a tool.
It's just a tool, but the system built around it is anything but neutral. This system is the true, powerful third person in the relationship.
And this section is so crucial because it gives us the vocabulary to understand why we feel such profound shame and pressure. These mechanisms are what transform a basic economic reality into a relentless social judge.
Okay, let's start with mechanism number 1, the market economy and identity. This really sets the premise for our sense of worth.
It absolutely does. Our entire society is built on the premise that a person's value is largely derived from their productivity and their market output. And so income very quickly becomes the primary soft identity card.
A soft identity card, I like that.
When you meet someone new, whether you're conscious of it or not, their job title, their salary range, their financial trajectory, it informs your perception of their stability. Money measures not just their capacity to buy things, but their perceived capacity for responsibility.
And how does that play out in the actual world of dating?
Well, it creates kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. A high income signals stability and security, making that individual automatically perceived as a lower risk partner. Conversely, a low income is often immediately unconsciously tagged as a potential burden or a sign of being unsettled. This mechanism forces people to bring their economic position to the table first. The sources note the rise of, dating profile language that focuses so heavily on career success and stability.
You see that all the time.
It's effectively commercializing the earliest stages of courtship. It's a measure of your capacity for commitment, but it's viewed through a ledger, not through a soul.
And this structural echo is then magnified dramatically by mechanism number 2, familial pressure. This is that persistent, multi-generational voice that's always in the background.
Familial pressure is born almost primarily from historical hardship. For past generations, survival was everything, and the family was the collective economic unit. So that crucial question, does he or she love you, has always been inextricably coupled with the existential question, can he or she support you through a crisis?
So when a parent asks about your partner's job or their prospects, it's not necessarily them being controlling.
It's not malicious interference. For most, use the language of love. but translated through decades of economic volatility, through wars, depressions, housing insecurity.
They're expressing a deep inherited fear about their child's stability.
Exactly. And this creates this persistent, quiet voice in the background of the relationship, a voice that's asking every time a shared expense comes up, do we have enough of a margin to go the distance? And if the partner fails to meet the family's implicit inherited standard of stability, the pressure that results can turn minor financial differences into these major existential crises that shake the very foundation of the couple's confidence in themselves.
All right, moving on to mechanism 3, the commercialization of love. This is the consumer market actively creating emotional demand and then tying it directly to a price.
This is one of the most toxic mechanisms, I think. The consumer economy has masterfully translated abstract emotions like commitment, adoration, even an apology, into quantifiable products.
Give me an example.
Love is represented by elaborate, expensive gifts, by destination trips, by huge engagement rings and these picture-perfect, Instagrammable anniversary experiences. Emotion gets a price tag, and often there's this insidious implication that a higher price means deeper commitment or greater sincerity.
So love becomes a product, and lovers become customers who are expected to meet some kind of minimum spending quota to prove their feelings.
And the irony of it is brutal. Those with significant financial means, they often feel less of this pressure because they can meet these consumption demands so effortlessly.
Of course.
But the vast majority of people, especially young couples struggling with student debt or just making rent, they feel intensely judged. Their genuine non-monetary affection is constantly being measured against a manufactured, media-driven standard of consumption they simply cannot afford. They feel like they are failing at love because they are failing to pay the price demanded by the market.
And mechanisms 4 and 5, they really address our societal preparedness, or the profound lack of it, and the distorted standards we consume every single day. Let's start with the education gap, which is mechanism 4.
This is a fundamental structural neglect. Our education systems prioritize academic subjects like history and morality, which are important, but they provide virtually zero practical instruction in shared financial literacy.
That's so true.
Think about it. No one teaches young couples how to set up a sustainable joint budget, or how to negotiate contributions when your incomes are unequal without causing offense, or, critically, how to decline a financial burden that's being set by the other person or their family respectfully and firmly.
So we basically launch young adults into the most financially complex relationship of their lives. Marriage, cohabitation, with no map and no compass.
They are forced to self-teach through trial and error and a lot of painful conflicts. The sources call it an unannounced secret exam that everyone is forced to pass, but no one was ever allowed to study for. And this ignorance ensures that when financial problems arise, couples default to emotional blame instead of strategic planning.
And while our educational system is failing us, the media's filtered standards mechanism 5 are actively sabotaging our expectations.
Social media doesn't portray love. It portrays luxury love. We only ever see the highlight reel.
The curated version.
The big houses, the expensive dinners, the elaborate gender reveal parties, the perfect holiday trips. What is deliberately, systematically absent are the arguments over the unexpected utility bill.
Or the quiet desperation when the bank account hits zero.
Or the long, stressful, sleepless nights talking about a potential job loss. None of that is posted.
So we are constantly being judged and judging ourselves against a standard that is literally manufactured and filtered for public consumption.
Exactly. And this filtered standard leads real people living real, constrained lives to feel like comprehensive failures. They look at their own financially precarious or just modest relationship, and they judge it so harshly against an impossible staged image. It's the Kafkaesque court again, but this time it's administered by algorithms, and we're being judged by perfect, curated digital ideals.
And finally, mechanism number 6 brings us right back to that foundational injustice: economic inequality.
The continually widening wealth gap means that people aren't just loving differently anymore. They're often coming together from fundamentally different economic universes.
What does that look like in practice?
Well, if one partner grew up where the primary financial worry was crushing debt, and the other partner grew up where the primary financial worry was estate planning, their baseline assumptions about risk, about stability, about spending, they're almost irreconcilable without extreme, painful effort.
So their hearts might be singing the same tune, but their logistical realities are playing two completely separate, clashing songs.
It creates this persistent, grinding rift. The partner who is worried about making rent this month cannot authentically relate to the partner who is casually investing in a secondary property. And this disparity, it leaks into every minor decision, from deciding on a weekend activity to choosing a school district, and it creates this constant tension that the couple almost always misidentifies as a personal mismatch, rather than the inevitable consequence of trying to love across a massive economic chasm.
So to just synthesize this whole section, we can conclude that all 6 of these powerful mechanisms, they all converge to make the relationship the ultimate point of impact. We argue about attitude, we argue about personality.
But what we're really arguing about are the consequences of a flawed structural economic reality.
Okay.
We were never ever taught how to navigate together.
Okay, so now we have to shift from those external mechanisms to the internal consequence, the micropsychology of how money actually feels in a relationship. And it's so clear from the sources that money doesn't enter a relationship with a tangible sound. It enters with a visceral feeling.
It's a heavy, confusing feeling. A blend of profound shame, intense anxiety, and a real sense of personal injury. The financial reality is silent, but its presence is incredibly loud, and it's felt in the most fleeting, intimate moments.
Like when?
Think of the quiet tension in the air when a credit card is declined at a restaurant, or the microaggression of that forced, tight smile that the lower-earning partner gives when the higher-earning partner insists on paying for the 5th time in a row.
Yeah.
These aren't just financial transactions, they are emotional data points that are being logged.
And the sources make this really powerful claim that money isn't fundamentally a financial issue in a relationship. At its core, it's an ego issue. It acts as this brutal mirror.
It is the ultimate mirror. It magnifies every deep-seated human fear we have. It reflects our fear of inadequacy, our fear of negative comparison, and most terrifyingly, that core human fear of being abandoned and rejected because we lack the necessary resources for survival. If we go back to Camus for a second, he observed that man is more afraid of the world's judgment than the world itself.
In love, that world's judgment becomes hyper-concentrated. It's all in the eyes of the one person whose approval we crave the most.
Exactly. We fear our partner's judgment, or even just our projection of what they might be thinking, more intensely than we fear the actual economic hardship itself. We dread seeing the reflection of our own perceived failure in their look of concern.
And this leads to that painful, silent, existential question.
The question, if I strip away my income, my status, and my capacity to provide, do I have enough value left to be genuinely loved? And that question, that's where money causes the deepest psychological trauma.
The source material is so meticulous in detailing the specific psychological wounds and how they're inflicted on both sides of a financial disparity, and they're like mirror opposites of each other. Let's start with the lower earner. What is their particular trauma?
For the partner who earns less, the wound is characterized by this internal sense of shrinkage, of diminution.
Shrinkage.
Every time their partner pays for something significant, it reinforces this internal narrative that they are insufficient, that they are a burden, or that they are loving from a fundamentally unequal and subordinate position. And this slowly, systematically, erodes their self-confidence and their dignity.
So they're essentially forced by the societal structure into what you call a lower posture of loving, even if their partner is desperately trying to make them feel like an equal.
And that posture, it manifests in real behaviors. They might retreat from proposing activities that cost money. They might hide or minimize their small personal spending to avoid scrutiny. They may experience deep shame when they have to discuss their debt.
And the fear is what?
The fear is not just about losing money. It's about losing their voice and their agency in the relationship. They worry that their love and their efforts are being dismissed simply because they can't be quantified on a financial ledger.
Okay, now the flip side. The trauma for the higher earner is so unique. It's this form of silent isolation, a loneliness.
It is. Their core fear is often suspicion and the fear of exploitation. They worry constantly that the love they're receiving isn't genuine.
That it's conditional.
That is based on the security or the capacity or the material goods they possess. This is the painful ATM fear. They feel a constant obligation to spend or to provide, and if they ever express reservations about it, they fear sounding cold or ungenerous, which just reinforces their isolation.
So they're caught in this impossible double bind. Either I provide and risk being loved only for my money, or I withhold and risk being seen as uncommitted or selfish.
It creates a peculiar, lonely trap. They might find themselves unconsciously testing their partner's affection, looking for evidence that the relationship would survive if their income suddenly vanished tomorrow. And this results in the higher earner silently bearing financial burdens that they secretly resent, because the alternative, openly discussing that fear of being exploited, feels way too dangerous to the relationship's foundation.
And we also have to acknowledge that money represents so much more than just a dollar amount. It represents unseen effort, unseen sacrifice. And this is where dignity is often just fundamentally damaged.
This is so critical for understanding what the sources call existential fatigue. A financial disparity often means that one partner is working significantly harder, maybe juggling 2 jobs, sacrificing all their personal time, or enduring a highly stressful career just to maintain stability for the couple.
Right.
And when that partner feels that their relentless effort, their exhaustion, their sacrifice is unseen or ignored or even trivialized by the other partner's thoughtless or frivolous spending, it's a direct blow to their dignity.
It's a failure to respect the energy that created the money, not just the money itself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The source notes that the anger isn't about the $50 purchase. It's about the feeling that the partner does not respect the 10 hours of grueling, soul-crushing work that was required to earn that $50.
Wow.
And this perceived trivialization is a direct attack on their self-worth, and it creates an existential fatigue that drains the very capacity for love right out of them.
And all of these internal wounds from both sides, they lead inevitably to the failure of language, to the silence that suffocates the entire relationship.
It's a layered, stacked silence. The lower earner is silent for fear of wounding their own ego or being seen as dependent. The higher earner is silent for fear of sounding mean or calculating. Both partners are silent for fear of breaking the illusion of a pure, uncomplicated love.
And the conclusion is so stark and yet so simple.
Relationships in the end die not from a lack of love, but from a profound lack of language. They break down because the couple could not articulate their needs, their limits, their expectations, and crucially, their deepest fears about money. Love doesn't fear a lack of funds, it fears a lack of truth, and an inability to negotiate reality together.
So we have dissected the trauma, we've dissected the structure. Now for the pivot. How do we transition from this state of self-blame and silence toward a love that is, well, mature, truthful, and ultimately resilient? The sources offer a very clear starting point. It's about understanding the messenger.
Yes, we have to fundamentally shift the perspective away from internal blame. We have to stop asking, whose fault is this mess? And start asking, what external pressure is this conflict revealing to us? When money causes tension, it is simply the messenger delivering news of a deeply non-neutral society. News about high housing costs, unpredictable healthcare bills, or deep-seated cultural expectations about providers.
So when a couple is arguing about the price of a future home, they should try to look past the number on the page and see the systemic failure that made that number so astronomically high in the first place.
Precisely. Seeing the structure, seeing the system as the external enemy, it immediately reduces self-blame. It fosters compassion for your partner. It allows you to view them with humanity, recognizing that you are both struggling against a massive external force, not against each other.
It moves the conversation from personal failure
To shared objective problem solving.
And that realization, it validates the absolute necessity of dialogue. If we keep avoiding the conversation, the system will just use our conflicts to speak for us.
And the sources are insistent on this. If a couple doesn't actively learn to talk about money, money will dictate their relationship through silent resentment, through anxiety, and through 1,000 painful misunderstandings. The dialogue has to be based on vulnerability. We have to move away from accusatory language and center the discussion around our core feelings and our fears.
How difficult is that language shift in practice, though? Moving from accusation to vulnerability. It sounds simple, but all our instincts fight against it.
It is incredibly difficult. It requires overriding years of social conditioning that has taught us to equate financial difficulty with personal failure. But the shift is essential.
So what's an example?
Instead of saying the accusatory, you spend way too much money on restaurants, which immediately triggers defensiveness and shame.
Right, the walls go up.
The walls go straight up. The shift is to say something like, when we spend this much on dining out, I start to feel really unsafe about meeting our savings goal. And that triggers my anxiety about our future.
So the focus moves to the root fear, my anxiety, my sense of insecurity. And when you do that, the money stops being this monster.
And it becomes a shared objective symptom that the partners can address together. The focus moves from judging you to securing us.
That transformation is really the essence of a mature love, isn't it?
It is. And beyond that, the sources outline several concrete, practical steps that couples can take to build that trust and resilience. Because it's not enough to just feel good. You actually have to plan.
Okay, let's detail those practical steps for everyone listening.
First, establish a shared spending framework and a safety fund. And this is not about equal contribution, especially when incomes vary. It's about shared ownership. It's about a commitment to collective security. Even if one partner can only contribute $50 a month, that symbolic act of shared commitment reinforces the idea of partnership over dependency.
And the second point is about regularity and transparency, right?
Yes, hold regular financial check-in meetings, maybe monthly, maybe even weekly if things are tight. And these meetings have to be explicitly designated as non-judgmental spaces. The goal is not to conduct an audit or assign blame.
Right.
The goal is simply to ensure that the relationship's future isn't being silently jeopardized by current ambiguity. Transparency, even when the numbers are scary, is the fastest way to bait trust. It minimizes the space for that silent clerk to operate in the shadows.
And now let's get to the strategy that tackles the vagueness of fear itself, this profoundly useful reality testing exercise that we're calling the Kafka Stoic exercise.
This is such a powerful antidote to that existential dread we talked about. Stoic philosophy teaches us that fear loses its grip when we actually detail and confront the worst possible outcome.
So what do you do?
A couple should sit down together and in clear, specific detail, write down the absolute worst-case scenario that they secretly fear the most. Maybe it's a severe income drop, massive unexpected debt from a family emergency, or one partner losing their job entirely and needing full support for months on end.
And by confronting the granular, exact nature of that fear, the specific numbers, the estimated duration, the likely consequences, you pull the fear out of the vague shadows of that Kafkaesque court.
Precisely. Once the worst is known and quantified, it ceases to be a monstrous, unknowable shadow. It transforms into a series of logistical challenges. It allows the couple to say, okay, if partner A loses their job, this is exactly how much the safety fund buys us.
Yeah.
This is our timeline for reevaluation. This is plan A, and this is plan B.
That shared process of confronting the nightmare together, it weakens the existential terror.
Because it demonstrates a unified, committed will to survive reality together.
So the ultimate goal here isn't just about accumulating wealth. The real promised land is something far more valuable and I think more attainable.
True security is not found solely in wealth, because even immense wealth cannot save a relationship that lacks truth, honesty, and open negotiation. The real promised land is found in tranquility.
Tranquility.
It's the ability for both partners to sit together, to acknowledge the inherent chaos and uncertainty of modern life, to admit they don't have all the answers, but to commit entirely to learning and sharing the inevitable burden, without shame and without resentment.
And when that profound shared truth is finally established, when the couple has faced a shadow and built a shared language, money finally loses its defining power over the relationship.
It does. Money recedes. It goes from being that toxic third shadow that determines affection, and it becomes a logistical factor. It's like traffic or household chores or work schedules. It influences how they organize their life, how much they can budget for a vacation, but it no longer dictates or poisons how they fundamentally love each other. The couple gains control over their reality rather than being controlled by it.
This has been a necessary, and I'll be honest, a challenging deep dive. We started by confronting that deep denial and shame that surrounds money and relationships. And we acknowledged that by viewing finance as a pollutant to love, we actually handed this immense toxic power.
We then systematically dissected those powerful societal and economic mechanisms, from the market economy defining our identity, to the commercialization of affection, and the persistent problems of economic inequality and filtered media standards. We saw how they all converged to make finance this huge existential hurdle for modern couples.
And we saw that relationships often crumble not from a lack of feeling, but from a fatal lack of language to negotiate reality.
But the path forward is clear, even if it does require profound vulnerability. We have to shift the dialogue from blame to shared fear. We have to establish resilience through transparency and practical planning, and use that Kafka Stoic exercise to confront and neutralize our greatest financial anxieties.
Money doesn't destroy love. The refusal to acknowledge and talk about it does. We are all being required, by the era we live in, to adopt a more mature, a more truthful, and a more economically informed form of affection.
And to leave you with the final provocative thought posed by our source material. In a world where economic reality saturates every choice we make and every breath we take, you ultimately have an existential choice to make. Do you want your love to exist based on vague, inherited societal instincts and silent expectations, or do you want it to be based on the deliberate clarity, truth, and commitment that you consciously choose to build together?
That choice demands ongoing dialogue, and it is the starting point for every truly authentic future together. Thank you for diving deep with us today. Continue exploring this necessary dialogue in your own life.